I'm going to run through this quite quickly because I'm preparing myself to be embarrassed that I'm teaching a whole load of grandparents to suck eggs really by running through this. But in case there's anybody who actually has come for a briefing about how conference works, what we've got here, what you should now see on your screen, there's no official kind of handbook about how these things work. So what you see here is what I personally have learned from my own personal experience and observation over the course of 2 very recent conferences. And I'm not beginning to think it's going to be completely right, but because we've got Billy and Anne here, they can correct anything that I've got wrong. But I'm going to run through it quite quickly. Anybody who wants a copy after the meeting, just leave a note in the chat box or send a message to Robin and we can get you a copy. So it's a flowchart. Simply, it's about how policy is developed at conference through the use of motions and compositing. So in the left-hand section, you've got all the various bodies whose input goes into creating policy in the Labour Party. So you've got the NEC, the unions, the National Policy Forum that Anne sits on, which generates a report, and all of which feeds into the Conference Arrangements Committee that Billy sits on, including the CLPs. And we're all busy putting in motions. The NPF puts in a report to conference. The unions and the CLPs both put in motions. My understanding is that NPF policy proposals can be referenced back if people don't like them. So every aspect of the NPF report will be debated and will be voted upon at conference. And if people don't like the recommendations in that report, they can be referenced back. Having had a quick glance through this year's NPF report, I don't think there are a lot of actual recommendations, concrete recommendations in it. So how much scope there's going to be for referencing back, I'm not entirely clear. Very early on in the process, and it's important for this reason that delegates all go to their regional briefing, because that's where they get their voting papers. And on the first, in this case, I think on the Saturday afternoon of conference, every delegation is going to need to vote in the priorities ballot, which is how the CAC is going to decide which composites go forward for debate on the floor. So there are going to be 20 motions going forward for debate on the floor. The CAC will put those motions, the motions that have come in from unions and from the CLPs, into categories. They will put them into broad categories. So you may find 5, 10, 15, or just maybe 2 motions in a category that then goes on the list for the priorities ballot. So the priorities ballot is divided into policy areas, and each delegation gets a vote, or gets 10 votes, in fact, if you're a CLP delegate, to decide which motions you would like to see go forward, or which policy areas you would like to see go forward for compositing. That's an incredibly important ballot, and it happens very early, and quite often certainly CLP delegates don't quite know what they're doing. But you don't get a vote per delegate, you get a vote. If you're a CLP, you get a vote per delegation. So one member of the delegation goes forward. It's a paper ballot, takes place in a booth. You have to select 10 and pop your thing into a ballot box. Once the voting has taken place, then 20 motions go forward for compositing meetings. That will be 10 motions from the CLPs and 10 motions from the unions. It gets a bit complicated in the area because both CLPs and unions are voting on the same categories of motions that the CAC's put together. So if a lot of unions and a lot of CLPs have voted for the same motion, it doesn't mean that the number goes down below 20. There are still going to be 20 motions going forward. So that gets, the counting may get complicated at that point. Then the The compositing meetings take place usually in the evenings over the first 2 or 3 evenings of conference. I was lucky or unlucky enough to be part of the compositing motion that Billy referred to, which was the Brexit compositing motion, which went on till 2 o'clock in the morning and much blood on the carpet during the course of it. But I was also at the 2019 conference in the Green New Deal compositing, which actually became so long it took place over 2 evenings, and I think holds the record for being the longest compositing motion in history at 13 hours in total. So I've had plenty of experience in the compositing room. It's very important to understand that compositing is a consensual process. So don't go into the room thinking, well, we're going to have a debate, then we're going to take a vote on how many people in the room think we should say this and how many should think we should say that. It's an iterative process. People go away, they represent the motion, a new form of words, people discuss that, and eventually collectively you hammer out a consensual form of words. Important to understand that you can use no form of words that doesn't appear in one of the original motions that was put into the ballot. So you can't start redesigning policy at that point. It also helps to explain why sometimes when the motions come out of compositing, they really look like the proverbial camel that's been designed by a horse that's been designed by a committee and turns out to be a camel, because it will have had sentences picked from one motion and sentences picked from another and sentences picked from a third and stitched together. So they can look like fairly Frankenstein documents. Once the compositing, or towards the end of compositing, the meeting will decide who's going to propose and who's going to second the motion. That's quite important, and it's important to have somebody who can speak meaningfully and forcefully about the motion. Tends to be somebody who will have been very preeminent perhaps in the discussions in the meeting. Other speakers on the floor, once it goes to the conference floor, will be picked from by the chair. So only the proposer and the seconder come forward from the actual compositing meeting. Then we move on to the green box. So there's a conference debate takes place on the conference floor. And that's where the issue that Anne brought up may or may not come in. There may or may not be an NEC statement about this particular policy area. And because we're talking about PR essentially, and or no doubt constitutional reform, and it may be that, that motions get bundled together under a general constitutional umbrella, there may or may not be a statement from the NEC. I have to say that the 2 recent conferences that I've been to, there was only one occasion on which this happened. And it was in 2019. It was about the Brexit debate, and the statement was issued in the morning, and later that same day there were 2 Brexit composites came to be debated on the floor, but the NEC statement rather made the debates somewhat unnecessary, shall I say. Who knows whether such a thing might happen in this particular case, but it's a possibility. It's a possibility. So you've got to the conference floor. As we discussed just now, the chair will select speakers on some basis known only to the chair and those people sitting on the platform. Lots of people want to speak, and lots of people try to get the attention of platform and to get to speak. Whether or not, I have to say, in all honesty, whether or not it makes much difference to the outcome of the debate, what's said from the floor or what's said from the platform, I'm not entirely sure, because a lot of both CLPs and unions will have to some extent mandated their delegates to vote in certain ways on certain policy issues. So at the end of the debate, voting usually takes place just on the basis of a show of hands, and the chair and the chair's assistants will decide who has won. If it's not clear who has won, or if somebody specifically calls for it, the motion may then go to a card vote, and the card vote takes place on the floor with delegates putting in their cards into a ballot box, which then go off to be counted. So that tends to happen if the vote's too close to call. So there are clearly, three possible outcomes from any debate. Either the motion passes and succeeds, in which case it theoretically becomes party policy in some form or another, or the motion is defeated, motion falls, then it may become slightly politically more difficult to bring a very similar motion again the following years. So clearly that's something that we would hope not to happen to any of our PR motions. Third possibility is that the motion may be remitted, but I don't think anyone's at all clear how the process for this would actually happen, because clearly the proposer and the seconder would need to be involved in any decision to remit, and then it wouldn't go to a vote. And again, Billy being here is very useful. He may be able to explain to us how such a thing may or may not be possible. One final word of warning is that although I think a lot of us go to conference, and I certainly did the first time I went as a delegate, thinking that conference is sovereign and conference decides policy, that is only true up to a point. And when it comes to fighting an election, then a manifesto will need to be written. And the manifesto is not written by conference. It's written by a Clause 5 meeting, which involves the leadership, members of shadow cabinet, NEC, senior union officers, and so on and so forth. So there's no absolute guarantee that decisions that are made at conference find their way into a manifesto commitment. But obviously, every little bit of pressure that can be brought to bear on the political machine in our country is to the good. So that was a very quick run through. As I say, if anybody wants a copy of this, more than welcome.